deep in the isolated hollows of eastern Kentucky, where the Appalachian Mountains rise like ancient guardians, protecting secrets buried for generations. A documentary crew stumbled upon something that would haunt American consciousness for decades to come. It was late autumn of 1954 when filmmaker Robert Henshaw and his small team ventured into one of the most remote regions of Harlan County, commissioned by a private research foundation to document vanishing communities in rural America. What they found in a valley accessible only by a narrow dirt path was the Reddick family, a bloodline that had remained completely isolated from the outside world for over 120 years. The grainy black and white footage they captured, locked away in a university archive until its accidental rediscovery in 2003, revealed a reality so disturbing that it challenged everything Americans believed about their own hidden corners. This is not a tale of folklore or mountain legend. This is documented history preserved on film, witnessed by professionals, and verified by medical records that surfaced years after the initial encounter. The truth about the Reddicks was far more complex and heartbreaking than anyone could have imagined. The journey began on October 17, 1954, when Heno's team departed from the small town of Everett, Kentucky, population barely 800 souls. Their local guide, a weathered coal miner named Chester Mullins, had mentioned in passing that deep in the mountains, past where the logging roads ended, there lived a family that nobody had seen in living memory. Chester's grandfather had spoken of them, warning that the Reddicks kept to themselves and didn't welcome strangers. The film crew, hungry for authentic stories of American isolation, pressed Chester for more details. He reluctantly agreed to lead them, though his unease was visible even on the old footage. The terrain became increasingly hostile as they progressed, the October air crisp and cold, leaves turning brilliant shades of copper and gold against the gray sky. The cameraman, whose name was later identified as Donald Pierce, kept his equipment rolling even as they navigated treacherous paths, where one misstep could mean a fatal fall. The footage shows thick forests of oak and hickory, streams cutting through limestone, and eventually, after 4 hours of hiking, a clearing that seemed frozen in a previous century. The Reddick homestead appeared suddenly, as if the forest had deliberately hidden it. 3 wooden structures stood in various states of decay, built from hand-honed logs, darkened by decades of weather. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, the only sign of current habitation. What struck the crew immediately, visible in their recorded reactions, was the profound silence. No dogs barked, no chickens scattered, no normal sounds of rural life greeted them. As they approached cautiously, calling out their presence, the door of the main cabin opened slowly. What emerged would become the most analyzed and discussed footage in the entire documentary. A woman appearing to be in her 40s, but later determined to be only 28, stepped into the pale sunlight. Her posture was bent, her movements uncertain, and her facial features displayed characteristics that immediately alarmed the medical professional traveling with the crew, Dr. Samuel Broderick, from the University of Kentucky. The woman who identified herself as Sarah Reddick spoke in an accent so thick and archaic that even Chester struggled to understand her. Her words were a mountain dialect untouched by modern influence, preserving speech patterns from the early 19th century. Sarah was not alone. As the crew stood frozen, uncertain how to proceed, more family members emerged from the cabins. There was Elijah Reddick, identified as Sarah's husband, though the crew would later learn he was also her first cousin. His features mirrored hers in unsettling ways. The same prominent brow, the same widely spaced eyes, the same peculiar shape to the jaw. Their children followed, 4 of them, ranging from what appeared to be 5 years old to approximately 14. The children displayed varying degrees of physical abnormalities, from minor asymmetries to more pronounced developmental differences. The eldest boy, Thomas, had a severe curvature of the spine and walked with a pronounced limp. The youngest, a girl named Martha, appeared relatively typical, except for her unusually small stature and eyes that didn't quite focus properly. Dr. Broderick, visible in the footage making notes in a leather journal, later wrote that he immediately recognized the telltale signs of repeated close family unions spanning multiple generations. The genetic markers were unmistakable to his trained eye. Robert Heno, to his credit, approached the situation with unexpected sensitivity. Rather than recoiling or immediately focusing on the obvious physical differences, he engaged Sarah in conversation about their daily life, their history, their isolation. Sarah, despite her initial weariness, seemed almost relieved to finally speak with outsiders. She explained that the Reddicks had come to this valley in the 1830s, led by her great-great-grandfather, Hosea Reddick, who had fled from persecution in Virginia for reasons she only vaguely understood. Josiah had brought his wife, his 3 sons, and his 2 daughters into these mountains, seeking complete separation from a world he viewed as corrupt and dangerous. The family had sustained itself through hunting, gathering, and small-scale farming in the limited cleared areas. They had no electricity, no running water, no connection to any town or trading post. Everything they needed, they made or grew themselves. When asked about other people, about marriages outside the family, Sarah looked genuinely confused. Her ancestors had made a sacred vow, she explained, to keep the Reddick blood pure, untainted by outsiders who might bring disease or corruption. For 5 generations, Reeks had married only Reeks. The mathematical reality of this practice became horrifyingly clear as Dr. Broadwick compiled a family tree, based on Sarah's accounts, starting with Josiah and his wife Rebecca, who were themselves first cousins. The pattern continued unbroken. Their children married each other. Those children's children married each other. By the time Sarah was born in 1926, the genetic pool had become so restricted that she shared more DNA with Elijah than typical siblings would. The doctor's calculations preserved in his research papers indicated that the current generation of Reeks had a coefficient of inbreeding approaching levels typically seen only in experimental animal populations. The physical manifestations were evident in every family member, beyond the obvious skeletal abnormalities and unusual facial structures. The crew documented other signs. Several members had extra fingers or fused digits. Multiple individuals showed signs of developmental delays, and the overall health of the family was precarious. Sarah mentioned that many babies didn't survive their first year, that several of her siblings had died young, that her own mother had passed away at age 32 from complications the family could understand or treat. The second day of filming revealed even more troubling details. Heno's crew was permitted to document the interior of the main cabin, a dark space lit only by the fireplace and a few small windows. The living conditions were primitive beyond anything they had anticipated. The family slept on straw mattresses, wore clothes stitched from animal hides, an old fabric that had been mended countless times, and ate a diet consisting primarily of cornmeal, wild game, and foraged plants. Education was non-existent. None of the current generation could read or write. Their knowledge of the outside world was limited to fragmented stories passed down orally, creating a distorted understanding of reality. Sarah believed that the year was somewhere in the 1890s, having no accurate way to track time beyond seasons and generations. When told it was actually 1954, that there had been 2 world wars, that automobiles and airplanes existed, she listened with an expression that mixed disbelief with fear. Elijah Reddick proved more difficult to document. Unlike Sarah, who seemed almost eager to share their story, Elijah viewed the crew with open suspicion and hostility. He was a tall man, nearly 6 feet, but his frame was twisted by severe scoliosis that bent him at an unnatural angle. His speech was even harder to decipher than Sarah's, complicated by a cleft palate that had never been surgically corrected. Through patient conversation, the crew learned that Elijah served as the family's primary hunter and protector. He knew every inch of the surrounding mountains, could track animals with remarkable skill, and maintained a fierce dedication to preserving the family's isolation. When asked why he never sought help from the outside world, especially for the children's medical needs, his answer was chilling in its simplicity. He didn't trust anyone who wasn't Reddick blood. The outside world, he had been taught from birth, was filled with people who would harm them, take their land, destroy their way of life. Better to struggle and suffer among family than risk contamination from strangers because these forgotten corners of history hold truths that mainstream media refuses to show you, and you need to see what really happened in isolated America. The children presented the most heartbreaking aspect of the documentation. Thomas, the eldest at 14, had the mental capacity of a much younger child. He could speak only in short, simple sentences, and seemed unable to grasp abstract concepts. His physical deformities were extensive. The spinal curvature, a withered left arm that hung uselessly at his side, and legs of noticeably different lengths that made walking an obvious struggle. Yet despite these challenges, Thomas showed moments of surprising capability. He could identify hundreds of plant species, knew which were edible and which were toxic, and demonstrated an almost instinctive understanding of animal behavior. Dr. Broadwick noted that intelligence manifests in different ways, and that Thomas had developed skills necessary for survival in his specific environment, even if he would be considered severely impaired by conventional standards. The second child, a boy named Jacob, who appeared to be around 10, was mostly nonverbal. He communicated through gestures and sounds, and the family had developed a system of understanding his needs. His features showed the most pronounced effects of inbreeding. Eyes set unusually far apart, a very small chin, ears positioned lower on his head than typical, and fingers that curved at odd angles. The two younger children, Martha and a boy named Samuel, who appeared to be twins, though Sarah insisted they were born a year apart, showed somewhat less severe physical manifestations, but clear cognitive differences. Martha, as mentioned, was extremely small for her estimated age of 5, weighing perhaps 30 pounds and standing barely 3 feet tall. She clung to her mother constantly, showing extreme anxiety around the strangers. Samuel was larger but displayed repetitive behaviors and seemed unable to make eye contact with anyone, including his own family members. Dr. Broadwick spent considerable time observing the children's interactions, documenting their play patterns, their communication methods, and their responses to simple tasks. His clinical notes, later published in a restricted medical journal, described a family unit that had adapted to extreme genetic limitations in remarkable ways. Children who survived infancy had done so despite incredible odds, their bodies and minds shaped by generations of concentrated heredity. Each child represented both the resilience of human biology and the devastating consequences of violating genetic diversity. The crew learned that the current Reddick population extended beyond just Sarah's immediate family. In a smaller cabin lived Sarah's uncle Jeremiah, aged approximately 55, and his wife Ruth, who was also his niece, making her Sarah's cousin. They had 3 surviving children, though Ruth mentioned that she had given birth to 8 babies over the years, but 5 dying before their 2nd birthday. The pattern of infant mortality was staggering. Dr. Tadwick estimated based on family accounts that less than 40% of babies born to Reddick unions survived to age 5. Those who did survive often carried severe health burdens. Jeremiah himself was nearly blind, his eyes clouded by cataracts that had developed in his 30s. Ruth suffered from seizures that the family attributed to spiritual causes, but which the doctor recognized as likely epilepsy, another condition with genetic components that can be amplified by inbreeding. The third structure, barely more than a shed, housed Sarah's grandfather, Nathaniel, the oldest living Reddick, at approximately 78 years old, though he claimed to be unsure of his exact age. Nathaniel was bedridden, his body ravaged by what appeared to be multiple untreated conditions, including severe arthritis and possible heart disease. The footage from inside Nathaniel's dwelling remains some of the most disturbing in the entire documentary. The old man lay on a pile of furs and blankets, his body so twisted and contracted that he could no longer straighten his limbs. His mind, however, remained relatively sharp, and he proved to be the family's historian. In a lengthy interview that spanned several hours over 2 days, Nathaniel recounted the Reddick history as it had been passed to him. His great-grandfather Josiah, he explained, had been a religious man who believed that the world outside their valley was entering its final days of corruption. Josiah had interpreted certain biblical passages to mean that the faithful must separate themselves completely, must keep their bloodlines pure and untainted, must wait in isolated righteousness for divine intervention. This theological justification had been passed down through generations, evolving into an unquestioned doctrine that governed every aspect of Reddick life. Marriage outside the family wasn't just discouraged. It was considered a betrayal of their sacred duty, a contamination that would doom them all. Nathaniel spoke of his own parents, his grandparents, his aunts and uncles, all Reddicks married to Reddick. He described a childhood where physical abnormalities were so common as to be unremarkable, where infant death was expected, where suffering was interpreted as a test of faith rather than a consequence of biological reality. When Dr. Broadwick gently tried to explain the medical science behind genetic disorders, about how closely related parents increase the likelihood of inherited conditions, Nathaniel listened politely, but dismissed it as outsider nonsense. The Reddicks struggled, he insisted, because they were being tested, refined like metal and fire, preparing for their eventual salvation. The doctor's scientific explanations couldn't penetrate generations of ingrained belief. This ideological barrier proved to be one of the most frustrating aspects of the crew's visit. They could document the physical reality, capture the evidence of genetic damage, but they couldn't easily change minds conditioned by a century of isolation and reinforced belief systems. On the 3rd day, Robert Henshaw made a decision that would later generate considerable controversy. He proposed to the Reddicks that the children, especially those with the most severe medical needs, should be taken to a hospital in Lexington where doctors could provide treatment. Thomas's spinal curvature might be addressed with braces or surgery. Jacob's developmental issues could be evaluated by specialists. Martha could receive proper nutrition and growth monitoring. The reaction was immediate and severe. Elijah became furious, shouting in his difficult-to-understand dialect that no Reddick child would ever leave the valley, that hospitals were places where outsiders murdered people and stole their souls. Sarah, caught between her husband's rage and a visible desire to help her suffering children, dissolved into tears. Even Nathaniel, from his sickbed, added his voice to the refusal, declaring that accepting help from the outside would break the covenant that had sustained the family for generations. The film captures this confrontation in uncomfortable detail. Henshaw's well-intentioned, but perhaps naive proposal, the family's visceral rejection, the growing tension that threatened to turn violent. The situation was diffused only when Dr. Brodwick suggested a compromise. Rather than taking the children away, perhaps he could return with medical supplies, with medicine that might ease some of their suffering, with knowledge that the family could use to improve their circumstances. This seemed more acceptable to the Reddicks, though Elijah remained suspicious. The crew agreed to leave, but promised to return within a month with assistance. As they packed their equipment and prepared for the long hike back to civilization, Sarah pulled Robert Henshaw aside. In a moment, captured on film, but without audio, she spoke urgently to him, gesturing toward her children. Later, interviews with Henshaw revealed what she had said. She knew something was deeply wrong, that her babies kept dying, that the surviving children suffered in ways that seemed cruel and senseless. She didn't have the vocabulary to express genetic concepts, but she understood that marrying within the family was somehow connected to the problems. She begged Henshaw to find a way to help them, even if the rest of the family resisted. The crew departed the Reddick Valley on October 20th, 1954. Their minds reeling from what they had witnessed. The hike back seemed shorter, though the weight of what they carried psychologically made every step heavy. Chester Mullins, their guide, remained mostly silent during the return journey, clearly disturbed by the encounter. When they finally reached Evetts, the crew immediately contacted authorities, both medical and social services. Dr. D. Brodwick submitted a detailed report to the Kentucky Department of Health outlining the conditions he had observed and recommending immediate intervention. Social workers were mobilized. Plans were made for a larger expedition that would include medical personnel and law enforcement if necessary to ensure the family's safety. The documentary footage was processed and reviewed, providing visual evidence that corroborated every claim. Newspapers in Lexington and Louisville caught wind of the story, though initial reports were vague, referring only to an isolated family discovered in the mountains. In a moment that still haunts those who study this case. Leave a comment right now with the words that Sarah whispered to her eldest son in the film. Let them remember us, because these words carried a weight that no one understood until much later. The planned return expedition was scheduled for late November 1954. A team of 12 people, including Dr. Brooke, 2 other physicians, 3 nurses, 2 social workers, a county sheriff, and Robert Henshaw with his camera, made their way back into the mountains. Chester Mullins guided them again, though he expressed serious reservations about forcing help on people who had made their wishes clear. The journey took longer this time because they carried extensive medical supplies, food, clothing, and equipment. The November weather had turned harsh, with early snow dusting the higher elevations and temperatures dropping below freezing at night. The team pushed forward, driven by a sense of urgency and moral obligation. They reached the valley on November 23rd, just 2 days before Thanksgiving, anticipating a difficult but ultimately beneficial intervention. What they found instead would haunt every member of that expedition for the rest of their lives. The Reddick homestead was silent. No smoke rose from the chimneys. No one emerged to greet them or warn them away. As they approached the main cabin, the sheriff called out, identifying himself and announcing their peaceful intentions. There was no response. The door stood slightly ajar, moving gently in the cold wind. The sheriff entered first, his hand on his weapon, though he hoped desperately not to need it. The interior was empty, not just of people, but of possessions. The family had stripped the cabin of everything portable. The furs they used for bedding, their cooking implements, their tools, even the photographs that Sarah had shown the crew. The fireplace was cold, the ashes days old at least. They checked the other structures with growing concern. All empty, all abandoned, the Reddicks had vanished. The team spread out, searching the surrounding forest for any sign of the family's direction of travel. They found tracks, multiple sets heading deeper into the mountains, toward areas even more remote and inaccessible. The sheriff organized a search party, but the trail disappeared within a few miles, lost among rocky terrain that left no footprints. They searched for 3 days, calling out, leaving messages and supplies at various points, hoping the Reddicks would reveal themselves. The mountains swallowed every sound, returned only silence. As the weather worsened and the risk to the search party increased, they had no choice but to withdraw. The last footage Robert Heno captured was of the empty Reddick cabin, its doors swinging open and closed in the November wind, snow beginning to accumulate on the threshold. The family had chosen deeper isolation over outside intervention, had retreated into wilderness that most modern humans couldn't survive. The disappearance of the Reddick family became a minor sensation in Kentucky newspapers. Though the full details of their condition remained somewhat obscured, journalists speculated about why the family had fled, creating romantic narratives about independent mountain folk refusing to bend to government interference. The reality was far more complex and tragic. Dr. Broadwick published his findings in medical journals using the Reddicks as a case study in the dangers of extreme genetic isolation and the persistence of harmful practices based on misguided beliefs. The documentary footage was initially slated for a public release, but the university that funded the project decided it was too sensitive, to potentially exploitative. The film reels were cataloged and placed in an archive marked as restricted material accessible only to researchers with appropriate clearance. For nearly 50 years, the Reddick footage remained hidden. Occasionally, researchers studying Appalachian culture or genetic disorders would request access, would view the grainy, black, and white images, would write academic papers about isolation and inbreeding that few people outside specialized fields would ever read. The family themselves remained lost. Despite periodic searches over the years, no trace of the Reddicks was ever found. Some speculated they had died in the harsh mountains that first winter. Others believed they had gone even deeper into the wilderness, perhaps surviving in some hidden hollow unknown to the outside world. A few optimistic souls suggested that maybe, just maybe, the family had actually left the mountains entirely, had integrated into society somewhere under different names, had escaped their genetic prison. The truth began to emerge in 2003, when a graduate student named Jennifer Morrison, researching Appalachian social history at the University of Kentucky, stumbled upon the archive footage while looking for material related to a completely different project. Intrigued by the restrictive classification, she applied for access and was eventually granted permission to view the films. What she saw shocked her. This wasn't just historical curiosity. This was documented evidence of one of the most extreme cases of genetic isolation in American history, and almost no one knew it existed. Jennifer began the process of getting permission to bring the footage into wider academic circulation, arguing that the educational and scientific value outweighed privacy concerns, especially since 50 years had passed and the family's fate remained unknown. The footage was digitized, and in 2005, excerpts were shown at an academic conference on genetic diversities in human populations. The response was overwhelming. Geneticists, anthropologists, historians, and medical professionals recognized the material as extraordinarily valuable for understanding the real-world consequences of prolonged inbreeding. The full documentary was eventually released to academic institutions in 2007, though it remained restricted from general public access. However, in the age of the internet, complete restriction proved impossible. By 2010, portions of the Reddick footage had leaked online, generating intense public interest and considerable ethical debate about the family's privacy and dignity. The modern viewer watching the Reddick footage is confronted with uncomfortable questions. The family clearly suffered from circumstances beyond their control, born into a situation created by generations of ancestral decisions. They were victims of ideology, of isolation, of ignorance about biological science. Yet they were also human beings with dignity, with their own agency and beliefs, with a way of life that, however harmful, was the only one they knew. The footage doesn't sensationalize their condition, but presents it matter-of-factly, which makes it more impactful. We see Sarah trying to care for her children with obvious love, despite her own limitations. We see Elijah's fierce protectiveness, misguided though it may have been. we see children playing simple games, finding moments of joy in their difficult existence. The Reddicks were not monsters or curiosities. They were people trapped by circumstances, geography, and the accumulated weight of generational choices. In 2012, a potential breakthrough occurred. A woman in her late 50s contacted researchers who had published work on the Reddick case, claiming to be Martha Reddick, the youngest daughter visible in the 1954 footage. Her story was extraordinary. She explained that after the family fled deeper into the mountains, they had indeed survived that winter, Tugbarelli. Her father, Elijah, and grandfather, Nathaniel, had both died within 2 years of the move, succumbing to the harsh conditions and their already compromised health. Her mother, Sarah, she claimed, had made an incredibly difficult decision. Understanding that staying in the mountains meant death for her children, Sarah had led them out of the wilderness in 1957, leaving behind everything they knew. They had emerged from the mountains in West Virginia, not Kentucky, having traveled an incredible distance through terrain that seemed impossible. The woman's account described how Sarah had lied about their identity, claiming they were survivors of a house fire that had destroyed all their documentation. Sympathetic locals had helped them, providing shelter and assistance. The children, she said, had been enrolled in schools for children with special needs, had received medical treatment, had slowly adapted to the modern world. Her brothers Thomas and Jacob had struggled with the transition. Thomas had required multiple surgeries for his spine and had lived a difficult life, passing away in 1989. Jacob had eventually been institutionalized when it became clear he needed more care than Sarah could provide alone. He had died in 1995. Samuel, her supposed twin, had adapted better than expected, learning to read despite his developmental delays, and had worked for years in sheltered workshops. He was still alive in 2012, living in a group home in Charleston, West Virginia. The woman, claiming to be Martha, had documents, a birth certificate issued in West Virginia in 1958, listing her as Martha Brennan, daughter of Sarah Brennan, father unknown. She had photographs of a woman who bore a striking resemblance to the Sarah Reddick in the 1954 footage, though aged and weathered by hard years. Most compellingly, she had genetic markers consistent with severe inbreeding, which DNA testing confirmed. Her own health had been challenging throughout her life: growth hormone deficiency, vision problems, joint issues, and difficulty bearing children. She had married once, briefly, but her only pregnancy had ended in a stillbirth with severe genetic abnormalities. The researchers were cautiously convinced, while absolute proof was impossible without DNA from the original Reddicks. The evidence strongly suggested this woman was indeed Martha Reddick. Martha's account provided closure to one of the great mysteries of the case. The family had survived. Sarah had saved her children by making the extraordinarily difficult choice to abandon everything her family had believed for generations, to reject the ideology that had caused so much suffering, to embrace the outside world she had been taught to fear. The cost had been enormous. Losing her husband, leaving behind the only home she had ever known, lying about her identity, raising damaged children alone in a world she barely understood. But she had done it. Sarah Reddick had broken the cycle. When Martha shared this story, she became emotional, describing a mother who had been barely literate, who had worked brutal jobs, cleaning houses, and washing dishes, who had sacrificed everything to give her children a chance at better lives. Martha also revealed something that the 1954 footage had not captured. Sarah had been pregnant during the filming. She had been carrying her 5th child, a daughter who would be born in early 1955 during their deepest period of mountain isolation. That baby, named Ruth after the aunt, had been born severely compromised, living only 3 weeks before dying in Sarah's arms. Martha believed that losing Ruth had been the final catalyst for her mother's decision to leave. Sarah couldn't watch another child die, couldn't continue the cycle of suffering, couldn't maintain faith in an ideology that kept producing such tragedy. The death of baby Ruth in the frozen mountains had broken something fundamental in Sarah's worldview. It made her willing to risk everything for the possibility of change. The Reddick story raises profound questions about intervention, autonomy, and the limits of cultural relativity. Should Robert Henshaw and his crew have done more in 1954? Should they have forcibly removed the children despite the family's objections? Some argue that the suffering of those children, the preventable deaths, the physical and cognitive damage created a moral obligation to intervene regardless of parental wishes. Others contend that such forced intervention would have been traumatic, possibly violent, and might have violated the family's right to live according to their own beliefs, however misguided. The fact that the Reddicks fled when confronted with the prospect of help suggests they valued their autonomy, their way of life, more than they valued the relief that modern medicine could provide. Yet Sarah's eventual choice to leave to save her children by integrating into the outside world suggests that given time and space to make her own decision, she reached the conclusion that outsiders had been trying to impose. The scientific legacy of the Reddick case extends beyond this single family. Geneticists have used the documented example to model the effects of extreme inbreeding over multiple generations, to calculate the accumulation of harmful recessive traits, to understand how isolated populations respond to genetic bottlenecks. The Reddicks demonstrated that humans can survive remarkable levels of genetic restriction, but at tremendous cost. Every surviving child represented both biological resilience and the price of that survival in suffering and limitation. The case has been used in medical education to teach about genetic counseling, about the importance of genetic diversity, about recognizing the signs of inbreeding in clinical settings. The footage itself, despite its age and quality, remains one of the most powerful visual documents of these concepts in practice. The cultural impact has been more complex. The Reddick story has been used and misused in various ways. Some have pointed to it as evidence that isolated mountain communities are inherently problematic, feeding into stereotypes about Appalachian backwardness. Others have used it to argue for stronger government intervention in family matters, particularly regarding children's welfare. Still others have seen it as a cautionary tale about religious extremism and the dangers of ideological isolation. All of these interpretations capture elements of truth, while missing the essential humanity of the people involved. The Reddicks were not abstractions or symbols. They were real people who lived difficult lives, shaped by forces largely beyond their control. And because you understand that real history is more complex and heartbreaking than any fiction, in the final analysis, the Reddick family represents something profound about human nature. Our capacity to endure to love our children, even when we're damaging them through ignorance, to hold on to beliefs, even when they cause suffering, and ultimately in Sarah's case to change when the cost of not changing becomes unbearable. The Lost film from 1954 captured a moment in time, a family at a crossroads between annihilation and transformation. That Sarah Reddick found the strength to choose transformation. To save her surviving children by abandoning everything she had been taught to value stands as a testament to maternal love overcoming ideology. The footage shows us the before, the moment of crisis. Martha's testimony gives us the after, the difficult path to survival and integration. Together, they tell a complete story of an American family that almost destroyed itself through isolation, but ultimately found redemption through the courage to change. If this story moved you, hit the like button to help others discover these hidden chapters of American history. Share this video with anyone who appreciates real stories about human resilience and the complex choices people make when trapped between tradition and survival. These are the stories that textbooks ignore, but that reveal essential truths about who we are and what we're capable of enduring and overcoming. The Reddick family deserves to be remembered not as cautionary tale alone, but as human beings who faced impossible circumstances with whatever resources they possessed, and in Sarah's case, found the strength to break free. Their story continues to resonate because it asks each of us what we would do if born into similar circumstances, whether we would have the courage to question everything we had been taught, whether we could make the sacrifices necessary to save those we love from suffering we finally recognize as preventable rather than inevitable.